If you want to see how good you really are with geometry nodes, you have to watch these demos. If you can build even one of these generators from scratch, congratulations, you are firmly in pro territory. So let's get into it. Starting things off is this volume grid Laplacian animation that uses closures and bundles. It's perfect for creating organic growth patterns like fungi or bacterial colonies, and the results are genuinely incredible. This is a great reminder that some forms simply cannot be modeled directly. Your only real option is math, and geometry nodes is where that math comes to life. Next up is Kuldeep's fluid simulation. There are many ways to approach fluids: particles, meshes, hybrids, but here he blends multiple techniques to simulate fluids purely at the surface level, combined with displacement. Think dynamic paint, but turned up to 11. You're getting insanely detailed fluid motion without the cost of a full volumetric sim. This approach has massive potential, especially for abstract work. If Kuldeep takes this further and pushes it into a full 3D fluid simulation with the same level of detail, that would be genuinely groundbreaking. We can't enter 2026 without some fireworks, so here are a few, courtesy of Kagero. Everything you're seeing is built entirely in geometry nodes. The systems have proper gravity, secondary motion, and layered activity after the initial explosion. The next demo is by Faustkines, and it's a flawless animation of a glowing plant inspired by a Cinema 4D demo. I've actually been down this road before. I made a full tutorial on Top Channel 1-on-1 about 2 years ago and ran into the exact same problems he talks about here. Back then, bending and rolling the mesh directly was a pain, so the practical solution was to build the leaves as curves instead. In my case, I animated the leaves and then exported them as an Alembic file to lock the motion. That workflow worked, but it was more of a workaround than a clean solution. What's interesting now is that he points out how much easier it has become to roll and deform meshes like this directly. If that's the case, it probably means it's time to revisit and update that tutorial with the newer, more straightforward approach. Fractal animations are some of the most satisfying motion graphics you can watch, and in this demo, Cartesian Caramel shows off a beautiful fungi animation, very likely inspired by The Last of Us. What makes this especially interesting is that now that we have repeat zones in shaders, a similar approach could be pushed directly into the shader domain, opening up new possibilities for procedural growth, iteration, and variation at render time. Next up, we have a melting effect by Hamarai. I've also done a tutorial on building something like this, but his version is clearly a step beyond what I was doing a few years ago. In this setup, the Suzanne head doesn't just melt and stop. It keeps flowing after the initial collapse, behaving more like a liquid or melted candle wax. My version could only melt downward as a single pass. It lacked the layered behavior and continued flow you see here. Next up, we have this stepping animation by Cartesian Caramel, once again, and I really love the fracturing on this one. But he doesn't mention whether the fractures were done procedurally or if the ground was pre-fractured ahead of time. By the way, I also have a tutorial on how to do something similar, although mine focuses more on the setup and less on the animation side of things. If it doesn't exist in Blender, you can trust the community to build it themselves. A perfect example is Shahzod, who shows exactly how he created his Cell Fluids add-on. He starts with something very basic and readable, then gradually expands it, adding layers of detail, better shading, and continuous refinement. What's especially impressive is how this evolves into a polished 2.5D fluid simulation tool, all built entirely with geometry nodes. Gaussian splats are coming to Blender. Maybe not officially, but they're definitely coming. Alex Martinelli is the second person I've seen implementing Gaussian splats directly inside Blender, and that alone says a lot about where this is headed. Hopefully, this evolves into a clean workflow where you can import splats straight into a scene without jumping through hoops. Right now, they're easily one of the lightest and most efficient ways to bring real-world objects into Blender. They barely take up disk space, they're extremely fast to render, and for certain use cases, they completely bypass the usual modeling and texturing pipeline. If this becomes streamlined, it could quietly change how a lot of scenes are built. Now that hair can be generated directly in geometry nodes, you can animate it in ways that simply weren't possible before. That's exactly what Faustkines shows here, pushing hair beyond traditional grooming and into fully procedural motion design. Everything is generated inside geometry nodes, and it's all rendered in Eevee, which makes it even more impressive. The control you get over timing, flow, and deformation feels much closer to abstract motion graphics than classic character hair. This is one of those cases where A feature meant for one thing opens the door to an entirely new creative direction. If you're looking for Blender artists to follow, especially those doing serious Blender and geometry nodes R&D, you should genuinely consider Faust Kainz. What I really like about his demos is that many of them are inspired by work from other 3D packages or even single still renders, like this flower animation that originally came from Pinterest. Instead of just admiring the reference, he breaks it down and recreates the idea inside Blender. I really enjoy seeing different approaches to problems I've tried to solve myself. And once again, Faust Kainz doesn't disappoint. This rope twisting animation is a great example. I'm not entirely sure whether the rope simulation itself is handled purely in geometry nodes, but if it is, that's genuinely impressive. I explored something similar in a tutorial I made a few years ago, but my approach relied on a cloth simulation that I then converted into ropes. It worked, but the result was a bit glitchy. Most of the issues came from how I was generating random colors from indices that kept changing during the simulation. Looking at this now, it's clear that this setup could be significantly improved with the tools and node workflows we have today. They also have a flower generator worth checking out as well. If you're interested in exploring that setup or any of the other demos mentioned here, I'll leave all the relevant links in the description. Moving on, we have Procedural, creating facial expressions for his character using surprisingly simple techniques like adaptive subdivisions and cutout mesh. The cutout mesh is his own tool. It lets him draw shapes, assign colors, and then convert those drawings directly into meshes. What makes this approach so effective is how fast and flexible it is. You can iterate on expressions visually, almost like 2D shape design, and then bring that straight into 3D. For animators especially, this is a very powerful way to build expressive faces without getting buried in complex rigs or corrective shape keys. Here, Alex Martinelli shows a fully procedural feather built with geometry nodes, where the form, breakup, and variation all come from logic rather than manual modeling. Once the system is in place, you're not editing geometry anymore. You're editing behavior, which is exactly why procedural workflows in Blender are so powerful. Next up is a clever use of volume grids, and this is exactly why I share these demos. They don't just explain how a tool works, they show you the many different ways it can be used. Here, Alex Martinelli demonstrates how volume grids can be used to drive animations inside a mesh, avoiding slow and expensive Boolean operations altogether. Next is a simple but very satisfying snowball simulation by Cartesian Caramel. I honestly can't think of any other way to produce these results without geometry nodes. The particles start as a solid ball, then break apart. Some stick to the surface while others fall away, which rules out a traditional particle system or an RBD simulation. It's a very specific kind of behavior, and that's what makes it so impressive. The only downside with geometry nodes is access. Unless Cartesian Caramel is as generous as he was with the attribute node he helped bring into Blender's core, we won't get our hands on this snowball setup unless we build it ourselves. If you're a Patreon supporter or you already have the texture folders add-on, just a quick heads up that it's now been updated to version 3 with support for decals, masks, and a few other new features. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.